Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Amna Gul from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. We're back with the course Development Support Communication bearing the code GMC 413. It's our 7th lecture and the topic today is Development Communication as well as Development Support Communication. So we'll actually be discussing development communication and then we'll be comparing it with development support communication, and then we'll still continue our discussion towards development communication. So let's start off with development communication. Development communication is actually a communication strategy for the whole society. Development communication is an art, or you may as well call it a science of human communication, applied to the direct revolution of a country and its people from the state of scarcity and shortage towards a vibrant state of economic growth, which makes possible the high values of life and large fulfillment of human perspective. Remember, we have earlier discussed that communication is not only an art, but it is also a science. Why it is an art? Because there are so many so much diversity into it. It can be learned as a skill. It can be applied in so many different ways. Why is it a science? Because it follows certain processes, and when we'll be discussing the campaigns, we'll be discussing how one step leads to another. So development communication is actually meant for the revolution of the whole country. And obviously the country includes its people. To take them from scarcity or shortage towards economic growth, towards higher values of life. So this is what development communication is. One of the first examples of development communication was farm radio forums in Canada from 1941 to 1965. Farmers met in groups each week to listen to special radio programs. There were also printed materials and prepared questions to encourage group discussion. At first, this was a response to the Great Depression and the need for increased food production in World War II. But the forums also dealt with social and economic issues. This model of adult education or distance education was later adopted in India and Ghana. And then it was used in so many other countries, and it's been used since then. Even in Pakistan, there had been a lot of things that were related to agriculture, especially in when we had just the state-owned TV. There were so many programs running, and those were very famous programs because there was only one channel, and people used to follow it well. So this is a little introduction of development communication. Now we'll move towards the other details of development communication. So what are the features of development communication? It is applied at macro level. That is, development communication is applied in the projects or programs that are at large scale. As I said earlier, it is for the countrywide programs. Then it is technology based. It usually depends upon the technical mass media. Since something which is for the whole country, obviously it is run via mass media. If there is a communication campaign that is meant for the whole country, so obviously to reach the whole country you need the mass media. Then it is for the journal masses. That is, it is not for any specific community or a specific group of people, but the general public. So development communication programs, these are planned in such a way that the whole country needs this kind of thing. So it is not for example, a specific religious community or a specific gender or that kind of thing. No, it's for the general public. Then development communication does not have any specific goals. It has general goals. It is for the overall development in a sector or in an area. It is not, for example, to increase just the production of something. No, it is for the overall development of that sector or that area. Then it is also source oriented. That is, in development communication, the communicator does not care about the needs and levels of his or her target. So this is something technical here, because all the communication is based on the communicator. So how they feel about things, how so it's source oriented, how they plan, the communicators plan the things. It goes that way. There is not no involvement for the at the receiving end. Then there are no limits, but time is fixed for completion. Sign. So, like for that matter, for example, if it is a 1-year program, it runs for a year. As I said earlier, it does not have specific goals. It has journal goals, and finally, it works vertically top down. That is, the communication usually flows from the source towards the receiver. Obviously, if it is just the if it is source oriented or communicator oriented, automatically the communication is top down. So it flows from the communicator or from the source towards the receiver. Now let's move towards development support communication. As I said earlier, I'll explain that as well. Development support communication is a discipline in development, arrangement and accomplishment in which more satisfactory account is taken of the human behavioral factors in the design of growth projects and their objectives. It involves an understanding of communication methods and application in adult education, the process of change, diffusion of innovation, simple action and analysis, and we'll be discussing all these things later on. The practice of development support communication, as you can see it's called DSC as well, is a multi-sectoral process of information sharing about development agendas and planned actions. So why it is multi-sectoral? Because it links like planners, beneficiaries and implementers of development action, even including the donor community. It obligates planners and implementers to provide clear, explicit and intelligible data and information about their goals and roles in development, and explicitly provides opportunities for beneficiaries to participate in shaping development outcomes. It ensures that the donor community is kept constantly aware of the achievements and constraints of development efforts in the field. So it is here this level of communication is different because it actually takes into account the human behavioral factors, not only in the communication process, but even in the design of the projects or even in the setting out the objectives. So it understands the communication models, their application, and then it actually provides methods for sharing of development agendas and planned actions between all the different sectors involved in that development campaign. Development support communication makes use of all available structures and means of information sharing. Therefore, it is not limited to mass media alone. It does use mass media, but it is not limited to mass media alone. It also uses both formal group and non-formal channels of communication, such as women's and youth associations, as well as places where people gather, for example, markets or religious places, for example, mosques or churches, then the festivals and other meetings. So its contribution is in using these in a systematic, continuous, coordinated and planned manner to perform linkage and enabling functions. So development support communication is not just limited to mass media. It uses it, but it is not limited to that. It makes use of other formal and non-formal channels of communication available. For example, if there is any communication, any developmental project and you need, so you may take the help of, for example, the clerics, or if you need, you may take the help of, for example, local opinion leaders, or for example, you might use different events to actually support that cause. So it is once again a different way of doing it. The contribution of development support communication is in using all these different channels of communication in a systematic, continuous, coordinated and planned manner to perform linkage and enabling functions. It requires analysis of the communication environment, of the available and needed communication competencies and resources. For example, like if there's hardware needed or software or financial or human resource needed, and it clearly indicates expected results from specific resource inputs. So that is done in order to maintain accountability. In short, development support communication is a legitimate function of development planning and implementation. DSC therefore needs to be examined as a valuable technology for using the social communication process to foster and strengthen sustainable development at local and national levels. It should be taken more seriously in programs of social change and should be reflected explicitly in development policy and strategy. One way of doing so is through the enunciation of a national information and communication policy, which can be explicitly integrated into national development thinking and practice. Having said that, I'll just move towards some of the basic features of development support communication so we can actually differentiate between the two. Now, development support communication is applied at macro level. The projects in which it is used are launched and implemented at small scale. So do you remember I said it does use mass media, but it uses other channels of communication. So if you are using, for example, a local youth club, or if you're using a mosque, or if you're using certain meetings or events, so that means you have a limited scale. You are working in a limited area. That is why DSC is applied at micro level for projects on a small scale. It depends on interpersonal and culture-based forms of communication. So it is receiver-oriented. In contrast to development communication, the target audience is given special importance before communicating any message. It is for specific and fixed target audience. Since it is not for all people, so it's pre-planned. This kind of people would benefit from this campaign, and then it is targeted to them only. Thus, it has a specific, set and clearly defined goals. Like the goals are specific, those goals are set in advance, and these are very clearly defined. Then it has certain limits on the project. For example, the program is finished after achieving specific goals. And it is participatory at grassroots levels. In this communication, audiences are given maximum participation since it is at the grassroots level. So it is, and it is obviously receiver oriented. So whoever are the audiences or whoever the target audience is, they are given maximum participation. They are part of every process that is happening, especially in the communication design or development design stages. Now, let's continue with the discussion of development communication. Development communications are organized efforts to use communication processes and media to bring social and economic improvements generally in development countries. The field emerged in the late 1950s amid high hopes that radio and television could be put to use in the world's most disadvantaged countries to bring about dramatic progress. Early communication theorists like Wilbur Strom, you must have gone through their models, and Daniel Lerner, they based their high expectations upon the apparent success of World War II propaganda, to which academia and Hollywood had contributed. Also, with World War II came dozens of new, very poor countries left by their former colonial overseers with little infrastructure, education, or political stability. It was widely accepted that mass media could bring education, essential skills, social unity, and a desire to modernize. Walt Rostow theorized that societies progress through specific stages of development on their way to modernity, what he termed the age of high mass consumption. Lerner suggested that exposure to Western media would create empathy for modern culture and a desire to move from traditional to modern ways. Early development communications, especially those sponsored by the US government, was also seen as a means of winning hearts and minds over to a capitalist way of life. So that was more like, since these were times of propaganda, and in those times these were times of magic bullet theory. So media was seen as such a powerful tool, and they thought that it could revolutionize or modernize the countries as well. So it was that time. These early approaches made a number of erroneous assumptions and have been largely forsaken in contemporary approaches to development. Obstacles to development were naively seen as rooted in developing countries, not as products of international relationships. Modernization was presumed to equate to westernization and to be a necessary prerequisite to meeting human needs. Like, for example, they did not even expect, or they could not recognize, that every country has their own culture. They thought actually modernizing someone was actually like giving them all these Western concepts, and they thought those were the prerequisites or the necessary things for human needs. Development was seen as a top-down process whereby centralized mass media could bring about widespread change. Producers of development media often fail to ask if the audience can receive the message. For example, television penetration in developing countries was minimal, and radio penetration in the early days of development communication was light. Then these people, the producers of development media, even failed to understand the message. A problem in countries with dozens of language and dialects, so they could not understand that as well. Then acting upon the message with necessary tools or other forms of structural support, and want to act upon the message. So they fail to realize that all these things are dependent on the audience, whether they can receive the message or not, whether they can understand the message, because there are so many languages spoken. Can they act upon the message? Do they have the necessary structural support or other tools? And do they actually want to act upon the message? So these are different things that they simply skipped out or missed it. And since it was based upon a propaganda model, development communication efforts were often seen as propaganda, and these were also mistrusted. See, if it was based on propaganda model, automatically people distrusted these. Projects embodying these philosophies have enjoyed little success. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new paradigm of development communication emerged, which better recognized the process of deliberate underdevelopment as a function of colonialism, the great diversity of the cultures involved, the differences between the elite versus popular goals for social change, the considerable political and ideological constraints to change, and the endless varieties of ways different cultures communicate. So the new paradigm, it recognized so many different things. But in some instances, mass media technologies, including television, have been magic multipliers of development benefits. Educational television has been used effectively to supplement the work of teachers in classrooms in the teaching of literacy and other skills, but only in well-designed programs which are integrated with other educational efforts. Consumer video equipment and VCRs have been used. I'm discussing VCR because we are discussing the history. So those have been used to supplement communications efforts in some small projects. Some developing countries have demonstrated success in using satellite television to provide useful information to portions of their population out of reach of terrestrial broadcasting. In 1975 and 1976, an experimental satellite communication project called SITE, Satellite Instructional Television Experiment, was used to bring informational television programs to rural India. Some changes in beliefs and behavior did occur, but there is little indication that satellite television was the best means to that end. The project did lead to Indian development of its own satellite network. China has also embarked on an ambitious program of satellite use for development, claiming substantial success in rural education. When television has succeeded as an educational tool in development countries, it is only when very specific viewing conditions are met. For example, programs are best viewed in small groups with a teacher to introduce them and to lead a discussion afterwards. A variety of types of organizations work with local governments to develop communications projects. The United Nations provides multilateral aid to governments. Okay. Non-profit, non-government organizations, which are like NGOs, conduct development projects worldwide using UN, government, or private funding. And government agencies such as the US Agency for International Development, USAID, provides assistance to developing countries, but with political strings attached. So generally, there are three common types of development campaigns. The first one is persuasion, which is meant to changing what people do. So they persuade people to change what they do. The second type is education, change that is meant on changing social values. So educate people and change their social values accordingly. And the third is informing, that is empowering people to change by increasing their knowledge. Of these, the third approach is now perceived as the most useful. Over time, it was the other ones were given importance, but with the passage of time, so with the process of time, over time, all these three have been tried and tested, and it has come about that the third one is the most useful. So instead of attempting to modernize people, contemporary efforts attempt to reduce inequality by targeting the poorest segments of society, involving people in their own development, giving them independence from central authority, and employing small and appropriate technologies. The emphasis has shifted from economic growth to meeting basic needs, and this is a big change. Initially, it was seen as economic growth was the only development that was needed. And now over time, it's different. There are different needs, basic needs that need to be met for societies to develop. In this new view of development, communication becomes an important catalyst for change. But not its cause. Local folk media, for example, is employed to reduce media's bias towards literacy and provide information in a traditional, familiar form. Development journalism provides people with information on change in their society and works at the local level to advocate change. Where mass media is now employed in developing societies, community newspapers and radio prove far more accessible and useful than television. The rapid spread of entertainment television in the developing world is proving to be more of a disruption to traditional social structures than an agent of progress. One emerging genre of television does show promise for contributing to development. The telenovela, pioneered in Brazil, has demonstrated some success in disseminating pro-social messages. Such programs are now being evaluated in many countries for their effectiveness in contributing to population control, health education, and other development goals. People's participation is becoming the central issue of current times, and participation requires communication. So everything goes back to communication. Development programs can only realize their full potential if knowledge and technology are shared effectively, and if populations are motivated and committed to achieve success. Unless people themselves are the driving force of their own development, no amount of investment or provision of technology and inputs will bring about any lasting improvements in their living standards. Communication is central to this task in many ways. For example, it enables planners, when identifying and formulating development programs, to consult with people in order to take into account their needs, their attitudes, and traditional knowledge. Only with communication will the project beneficiaries become the principal actors to make development programs successful. Helping people at all levels to communicate empowers them to recognize important issues and find common grounds for action, and builds a sense of identity and participation in order to implement their decisions. On top of that, development involves change, that is, new way of doing things. Will people have the confidence to make a project work? Or will they acquire the new knowledge and skills they need? How can barriers of illiteracy be overcome? Communication media and techniques can be powerful tools to advise people about new ideas and methods, to encourage adoption of those ideas and methods, and to improve training overall. Communication approaches are also invaluable for improved coordination and teamwork to manage development programs and to gain institutional support. A decisive role can be played by communication in promoting human development in today's new climate of social change. As the world moves towards greater democracy, decentralization, and the market economy, conditions are becoming more favorable for people to start steering their own course of change. But it is vital to stimulate their awareness, participation, and capabilities. Communication skills and technology are central to this task, but at present, these are often underutilized. Policies are needed that encourage effective planning and implementation of communication programs. So, having said that, let's revisit what we have done today. Actually, we started off by discussing what development communication was. And we actually mentioned that development communication is a communication strategy for the whole society. So what we discussed today was we started off with discussing development communication, which we said it was communication strategy for the whole society, and it is something that is directly applied for the direct revolution of a country and its people from the state of scarcity and shortage towards a vibrant state of economic growth, which makes possible the high values of life and large fulfillment of human perspective. So development communication actually sees development as economic growth. We discussed this, then we discussed where it started from. It started from farm radio forums in Canada, and then it in the backdrop of World War, and then the same model was of adult education was applied to different countries for different sector growths in different sectors. And then we discussed development support communication, which is a different discipline in development in terms of that it makes more use of human behavioral factors. It actually considers all these factors in the design of growth projects and in designing the objectives of those projects. So this kind of development support communication, it actually involves an understanding of communication methods and application in adult education. It also understands or takes into account the process of change, how innovations are diffused in society, and then how simple actions are taken and how those are analyzed. Having said that, we had a comparison of development communication and development support communication. That development communication is applied at macro level. It is for projects and programs that are at large scale. while development support communication is applied at micro level, the projects in which it is used are launched and implemented at a small scale. Then the difference between development communication is technology based, while development support communication is more based on interpersonal and cultural based forms of communication. So we discussed some of the differences here. In our next class, we'll be actually moving towards the new perspective towards development, and then we'll understand how it all works. That's all for today. Thank you.